Drew Hunter sat in the dim glow of his apartment, fingers flying across the keys as he typed commands into his terminal. His eyes were bloodshot, and the half-empty coffee cup beside him sat forgotten, its contents cold and bitter. He'd been at this for hours, no, days, chasing the ever-elusive next gig, the one that would pull him out of this digital trench he'd been living in for too long. The computer screen flickered, and a small notification pinged on his monitor. He barely glanced at it. Another scam or another ad for some shady software. He'd long ago stopped caring about the odd messages that populated his inbox like virtual rats. But this one was different. New message, we need your skills. The message appeared simple, almost too simple. No subject, no introduction, just those 6 words. His fingers paused mid-type. He glanced at the sender's name, and his heart skipped a beat. The Vexers. His first thought was to ignore it. The Vexers were a myth. A hacker collective that only existed in the whispers of underground forums, their activities mostly confined to rumors about fights with major corporations and shadowy operations. But something in the air tonight made him curious, more curious than he'd been in a long time. That he clicked on the message. Hey Drew, we know you've been out of the game for a while, but we've got a job you might be interested in. Something big. Something that'll let you stick it to Neuromind for good. You in? It was signed simply, Zircon. Drew leaned back in his chair, the creaking of the old leather backrest echoing in the quiet apartment. He hadn't heard that name in years. Zircon was a legend, a hacker who had burned every bridge he'd ever built, all in the name of taking down the behemoth corporations that controlled the digital world. And Neuromind? They were the big one, the titan of tech, the company that not only dominated the virtual world but was slowly beginning to conquer the real one as well. He clicked on the reply box without thinking. How much? The response was almost instantaneous. Big enough to make you rethink everything. Meet us at the usual spot. Drew's mind was already racing. The usual spot? A dingy bar in the heart of the city, where the neon lights flickered like ghosts, and the people who gathered there weren't afraid to talk about the things most people ignored. It had been years since he'd set foot in that place, years since he'd done anything beyond scraping by in the world of freelance hacking. But this? This felt different. The bar smelled of stale beer and regret. Drew stood at the entrance, his hand resting on the doorframe as he surveyed the dimly lit room. A few patrons sat hunched over their drinks, lost in the haze of their own lives. No one seemed to notice him as he made his way to the back, where a small booth sat tucked in the corner, away from prying eyes, and there, waiting for him, was Zircon. He looked exactly as Drew remembered, tall, with a rough face and an air of someone who'd seen too much. His eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, even though it was well past midnight. When Zircon saw Drew, he nodded, signaling him to sit. Nice to see you again, Hunter, Zircon said, his voice smooth and deliberate. Drew slid into the booth across from him, his mind still swirling. What's the job? Last I checked, you were out of the game. You've got to be desperate to come crawling back to me. Zircon smirked. Desperate? No. But there are things that even a guy like me can't handle alone. He leaned forward, his hands steepled in front of him as if preparing to make a confession. We need your help with something big. Something that'll change the game. Neuromind has been working on something. It's called the Dimensional Gateway. Drew raised an eyebrow. Dimensional Gateway? That sounds like sci-fi bullshit. It's not. Not anymore. Zircon's expression grew serious. Neuromind has developed a system, a digital world that is linked to the real one. And I mean really linked. People can live in this world, live out entire lives without ever needing to leave it. But here's the thing, it's a parasite. The longer someone stays in, the more it drains from their physical bodies. Their energy, their vitality, even their very life force. Drew stared at him, disbelief written across his face. You're telling me that Neuromind has built a virtual reality that can actually suck the life out of people? That's insane. It's real, Drew, Zircon said, his tone uncharacteristically grim. And the worst part? They're already testing it on people. There are those who've been in the system for so long that their bodies are just husks. But they don't even know it. They're too deep in the illusion. Neuromind's got a whole army of users plugged into their servers, and we need to stop them before it spreads any further. Drew's mind was racing, but the cynicism he'd carried for so long kept him grounded. Sounds like you're asking me to break into Neuromind's servers and sabotage their project. How do I even know this isn't some elaborate con? Zircon's lips twitched. Because we know about the dimensional breach. We know how it works. And we know that unless we stop them, it won't just be people in the virtual world who are in danger. It'll be the real world, too. Drew exhaled sharply, leaning back in his seat. The gravity of the situation was starting to sink in. Neuromind wasn't just another corporate giant, it was a monster, a parasite. And if what Zircon said was true, the digital world they were building wasn't just some utopia. It was a death trap. All right, Drew said, the words leaving his mouth before he could fully process them. I'm in. But I want full access to everything. No secrets. If I'm going down this rabbit hole, I'm bringing everything with me. Zircon nodded. You'll get everything. But you need to understand, Drew, this won't be easy. The deeper we go, the harder it'll be to separate reality from the illusion. And once we're in, there's no turning back. Back at his apartment, Drew prepared for the mission. He had been in enough virtual environments to know that this wasn't going to be like the simple hacks he'd pulled off in the past. He wasn't just stealing data, he was going to break into Neuromind's digital fortress and shut down their entire operation. The night was silent as he hooked himself into the rig, wires curling around his limbs like a serpent. His vision blurred as the software took hold, and for a moment, he felt like he was falling. When his eyes cleared, he found himself in the middle of a vast city. Neon lights danced across towering skyscrapers, their reflections shimmering on the streets below. Hover cars zipped through the air, while digital avatars strolled past, immersed in their own worlds. It was a dazzling, beautiful place, almost too perfect. Welcome to the Dimensional Gateway, Zircon's voice crackled through his earpiece. Now, remember, you're not just hacking code here. You're dealing with a system that's alive. Everything you do has consequences. Drew adjusted his avatar, a cyberpunk version of himself, complete with a leather jacket and a smirk. He wasn't entirely sure what he was walking into, but one thing was certain, this was no ordinary job, and if Zircon's warnings were true, the stakes were higher than he could possibly imagine. Drew stood on the streets of the virtual city, the air humming with the low thrum of digital life. People walked past him, their faces blurred, their movements synchronized as if they were all part of the same algorithm. The world around him was perfectly sculpted, a gleaming paradise of high-tech wonders. But there was something unsettling about it, an emptiness beneath the surface. It looked real, but it felt fake. He adjusted his leather jacket, now much sleeker in his avatar form, and checked his watch. The time felt off. His body wasn't here. He knew that. His physical form lay somewhere in the real world, plugged into a machine, but in this place, in this simulated existence, time didn't move the way it should. His mind raced as he tried to anchor himself to the task at hand. Hack the system. Shut it down. Save the people trapped in here. Simple enough, or so it seemed. He could feel the subtle pull, though, that slow, insidious tug that this world had on him already. The longer he spent here, the more the reality of the mission felt distant, the more the lines between the two worlds began to blur. Focus, Drew, Zircon's voice crackled through his earpiece, pulling him out of his wandering thoughts. You're in. Now let's get to work. He nodded, even though Zircon couldn't see him. Yeah. Let's do this. The first step was finding the server hub, the heart of the dimensional gateway. Drew had read about it, studied the blueprints Zircon had sent him, but seeing it now in person, in this hyperreal digital space, made it all the more daunting. The server was hidden in plain sight, a massive, sleek tower that towered over the virtual skyline. It had been designed to look like part of the city itself, another glittering building among thousands, indistinguishable from any other. But Drew knew better. He had to get inside. He began walking toward the tower, his steps quick but deliberate. As he passed the crowds of avatars, he couldn't help but notice how detached they seemed. No one looked at each other. No one interacted beyond the basic functions of the virtual world. They were stuck, each person floating in their own digital bubble, completely unaware of the price their bodies were paying in the real world. It was sickening. As he neared the entrance to the tower, two guards materialized out of thin air. They wore black suits and mirrored sunglasses, their faces unreadable. "State your business," one of them said in a monotone voice. His presence was calm, almost too calm, and Drew immediately recognized the tactic. The guards weren't just programs. They were part of the system, built to assess and react in real time, designed to defend the heart of the dimensional gateway. "I'm here for a meeting with the system administrator," Drew said, maintaining his best poker face. He wasn't sure if the guards would buy the lie, but he had to try. He knew Zircon was watching, waiting for the signal. The guards exchanged a glance. One of them stepped forward, reaching out to scan Drew's avatar with a handheld device. The screen flickered as it scanned him, analyzing every aspect of his digital identity. Drew's heart skipped. "Come on, come on." The scan finished. The guard gave him a curt nod. "Proceed." Drew didn't waste a second. He moved quickly, stepping past the guards and through the entrance of the tower. Inside, the environment shifted. The sterile, industrial vibe of the lobby gave way to a cold, metallic hallway. The walls were lined with glowing lines of code that ran like veins through the space, pulsating with each step he took. This was it. "The heart of the system, Zircon," Drew muttered under his breath, speaking into his earpiece. "I'm in." "Good," Zircon's voice came through, laced with tension. "Head to the central node. It's in the core of the building, but it's heavily protected. You'll need to bypass their firewall first. You ready?" Drew grinned, though no one could see it. "Been ready for years." He walked down the hallway, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The deeper he went into the tower, the more his senses sharpened. He could feel the layers of the system surrounding him, each one a piece of digital code that bent to his will. This was where he thrived, the intersection of chaos and control, where every click of a keyboard was a choice between winning and losing. At the end of the hallway, Drew found what he was looking for, a set of reinforced doors, glowing with an eerie blue light. He knew this was where the firewall would be. The core of the system was just beyond these doors, but getting through wouldn't be easy. Taking a deep breath, Drew crouched down and pulled up his interface. His fingers danced across the virtual keyboard in his mind, connecting to the system's defenses. He felt the weight of the task pressing down on him. This was no longer just a job. It was a battle. The firewall was a massive, living entity, an organic defense built into the very fabric of the dimensional gateway. It was constantly shifting, constantly adapting to intruders. He wasn't just hacking it, he was fighting it. Zircon's voice echoed in his earpiece. "You've got this. Just remember, don't go too deep. If you trigger the alarm, they'll lock everything down. You'll be trapped in there with no way out." "I know," Drew muttered, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the lines of code flickering across his screen. He was in. The firewall was strong, but it was also predictable. He'd fought worse systems before. It was just a matter of patience. Minutes passed. His fingers worked tirelessly, pushing and pulling at the code, bending it, twisting it. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the pressure mounted. The firewall was starting to break. With each passing second, Drew could feel the system begin to unravel, the defenses weakening. Then, with a final keystroke, he breached the core. The doors before him slid open, revealing the heart of the dimensional gateway. It was vast, a cavernous chamber filled with rows of servers, each one glowing with a soft, pulsing light. At the center of the room stood a massive terminal, its screen filled with cascading lines of data. Drew could feel the hum of the system in the air, the electric charge running through his veins as he took his first steps toward the terminal. "Now, Drew," Zircon's voice came through again, low and urgent. "Shut it down." Drew moved quickly, his hands working with practiced precision. He could feel the weight of every decision he made now. This was the moment. The terminal blinked before him, and he accessed it, diving into the code that controlled everything. It was here, this was where the dimensional gateway lived. And if he could destroy it, he could end it all. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment. He was about to make a choice that would change everything. The system before him was fragile now, teetering on the edge of collapse. But with one wrong move, he could trigger a chain reaction that would destroy everything, both virtual and real. He hesitated, and then, without another thought, he pressed the key that would bring it all down. Drew's finger hovered above the key for a long, breathless second. The tension in the air felt suffocating, a creeping awareness that one wrong move could doom them all. The terminal in front of him seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its digital veins thrumming beneath his fingertips. This was it, the moment of truth. He slammed his finger down, and the command was sent. For a brief instant, nothing happened. The terminal screen flickered, and Drew's heart skipped a beat. Had he done it wrong? Had the system caught on to his intrusion? His mind raced as he glanced around the room, waiting for some kind of response. But then, slowly, the entire building seemed to hum with an energy, a resonating shift that swept through the tower like a shockwave. The dimensional gateway was beginning to collapse, the walls of the server room shuddered, and the terminal before him erupted in a blinding cascade of code. It wasn't the smooth, ordered data Drew was used to seeing. No. This was chaos. The digital world, the world Drew had entered moments ago, began to break apart in real time. Flashes of light and erratic bursts of data flooded the room, a violent storm that tore apart the reality of the virtual city outside. The hum became a deafening roar, and Drew's pulse quickened. "Zircon," he shouted, his voice almost drowned by the cacophony. "It's happening. I've triggered something. It's coming apart. Stay with it." Zircon's voice crackled through his earpiece, but there was a tremor to it, an edge of panic Drew hadn't heard before. "You've got to shut it all down before it spreads. If you let this thing spiral out of control, I know," Drew cut him off, his mind working furiously. He wasn't sure how much time they had, but he couldn't let this moment slip. He had to finish what he started. He dove back into the terminal's fractured code, his fingers moving faster than they ever had before, pushing past layers of glitching data, bypassing firewalls and security protocols that were frantically rebuilding themselves. The virtual world around him was no longer stable. The gleaming skyscrapers that had once towered over the city began to fracture, their walls flickering like bad reception on an old television. The floating cars that had zipped by just moments ago froze mid-air, glitching and distorting like they had been caught in an invisible web. The avatars of the trapped users began to flicker as well, their forms warping and stuttering, as if their very existence was being corrupted. Drew's stomach churned. This wasn't just some malfunction. This was the system fighting for its life, and the longer he stayed inside it, the more he could feel it pulling at him, trying to trap him, to keep him in its tangled web. But he couldn't stop now. The terminal before him buzzed, its screen filling with an array of warnings and error messages. System overload. Core stability compromised. The more errors it threw at him, the clearer it became, the dimensional gateway was dying. And in its death, it wasn't just the digital world that would be consumed, it was everything that relied on it. Including the real world. Drew gritted his teeth, pushing the panic down. He'd come too far. This was bigger than any one person, bigger than even him. His fingers flew over the virtual keyboard, tracing the code, finding the heart of the system. He could feel it now, the pulse of the entire virtual ecosystem, the flow of life that had been siphoning energy from the real world, feeding on the souls of the users plugged in. It was the epicenter of the parasitic cycle. Disconnect it. Sever the link. His thoughts were clear now. There was no hesitation. He knew what had to be done. As his fingers pressed the final sequence of commands, there was a moment of pure silence. The entire world, both the real and the digital, seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a jolt, the terminal screen exploded in a burst of static, and Drew felt it, the rush, the sudden weightlessness as the dimensional gateway ripped apart in one final, cataclysmic eruption. The digital world around him fractured like glass, the gleaming skyline collapsing into itself, turning into a swirling mass of corrupted data. The avatars around him, those poor souls, began to vanish, their forms disintegrating into fragmented code as their minds were forcibly torn from the system. Drew stumbled back, his body reacting as if it were about to fall. The ground beneath him shuddered, the once stable virtual environment spiraling out of control, disintegrating into nothingness. The rush of data, the sensation of being pulled through space, through time, hit him like a truck. It was as if he were falling through every moment in every world at once. His mind spun. He felt a cold sweat breaking out on his skin, his stomach lurching as if the very gravity of the real world had vanished. His mind was still plugged into the virtual, his body still trapped in that liminal space between both realities. Drew, Zircon's voice came through, but it sounded distant, warped, as if he were miles away. Get out now. You've done it. Get out. Drew shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. He couldn't focus. The code was falling apart around him, and the ground, if it could even be called ground anymore, was giving way. The feedback from the collapsing virtual world was overwhelming, draining his energy, his life force. He had to get out, or he'd be consumed too. He pulled himself up, his hands shaking as he tried to navigate the crumbling environment. The world was breaking apart faster now, pixelated fragments floating in the air like dust. He could feel the sharp sting of disconnection, a pull in his chest, like something vital was being yanked from him. He knew what was happening. He wasn't just severing the link for the virtual world's users. The collapse of the system was draining the life from anyone who was still connected, anyone who was still plugged into the gateway. His fingers scrambled to find the exit, but the world seemed to be slipping away from him. For a moment, he thought he saw faces, real faces, flashing in the fragmented air. People whose lives had been lost, drained, consumed by this thing. The weight of it hit him like a physical blow. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't think about that now. Zircon! Drew shouted, his voice cracking as his mind flickered between the virtual and the real. He wasn't sure if he was still in the system, if his body was still in the real world, or if it had all just gone. How do I get out? Head for the exit node. It's the only way. Don't let it pull you back. He scrambled, feeling like he was moving through thick mud as the world crumbled around him. But then, in the distance, he saw it, a flicker of light, an opening. The exit node. With every ounce of strength he had left, Drew sprinted toward it, the weight of the collapsing world dragging at him. He reached out as the ground beneath him disintegrated entirely, and in that final, frantic moment, he felt himself being pulled, violently, through the tunnel of code. The last vestiges of the virtual reality ripped away, and with one final surge, Drew was free. He woke up in the real world with a violent jolt, his body slamming back into his chair, the wires around him snapping free. The sterile, silent hum of his apartment was deafening after the chaos he had just endured. His chest heaved with ragged breaths, his heart pounding in his ears, his eyes darted to the monitors, but the screens were empty now, no messages, no notifications. Just the eerie glow of a dead system. The adrenaline faded quickly, leaving behind a feeling of emptiness. The world outside his apartment was the same as it had always been. But Drew knew something had changed. He had made his choice. He had saved those trapped in the gateway, but the cost was high. He wasn't sure how many had been lost in the process, how many were now waking up, confused and broken. He couldn't undo what had been done, but there was one thing he knew for certain: the real war had just begun.